"Mom, please don't leave me." The desperate cry of the sick, feverish and weak little boy tore through the cold forest night, but it was muffled by the relentless roar of the receding engine. He fell to his knees on the damp earth, his body trembling, tears streaming down his pale face as the darkness swallowed the last light of the headlights. Abandoned, alone. The icy air cut at his skin, and an ancestral terror gripped his chest, for something was moving in the shadows, and what he discovered would change his destiny forever. The little boy, with fever throbbing in his temples, felt a shiver that wasn't just from the cold. It was the primal fear before a beast, mixed with a strange and intoxicating fascination. The shadows stirred, and from them emerged an imposing and majestic form. It wasn't a hungry predator, but a being of rare beauty and power. Two deep blue eyes, almost ethereal, fixed on him, and then the immaculate white fur, like the purest snow, with delicate, almost transparent stripes, revealed an albino tiger. The air around them vibrated with an indomitable energy. The tiger approached slowly, its silent steps barely disturbing the dry leaves. It stopped a few feet away, its large, powerful head lowered, blue eyes observing the boy with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his soul. The little boy, paralyzed, could barely breathe. He expected the attack, the end the forest promised, but the tiger merely tilted its head, a soft sound, almost a deep purr, vibrating in its chest. It was a sound that did not denote threat, but a kind of recognition. With a slow and calculated movement, the beast lay down at a safe distance, yet close enough for the boy to feel the heat radiating from its massive body. The biting cold of the night seemed to recede a little. The little boy, exhausted and confused by the fever, watched the creature. His eyes were heavy, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from this unexpected guardian. The loneliness that had oppressed him since his stepmother abandoned him began to diminish, replaced by a strange sense of protection. This animal, so feared and powerful, seemed to offer refuge. The tiger, sensing the boy's weakness, rose again with surprising agility. It turned, took a step, and looked back, as if inviting him to follow. The little boy, hesitant, tried to stand. His legs trembled and dizziness made him sway. The tiger then did something even more extraordinary. It approached, gently nuzzling its snout against the boy's outstretched hand, a gesture that seemed to say, "Don't be afraid, I am here." The soft, warm fur against his feverish skin was a balm. With a tenderness that belied its wild nature, the tiger gently nudged him, guiding him through the trees. Each step the boy took was a monumental effort, but the constant protective presence of the beast gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. They walked for what seemed an eternity. The forest silence that was once terrifying, now filled only by the soft sounds of the tiger's steps and the little boy's ragged breath. With each passing moment, the connection between them deepened, an invisible bond woven by despair and compassion. Finally, the tiger stopped before a dark opening in a rock. It was the entrance to a cave, hidden by dense vegetation. The air emanating from within was noticeably warmer, an invitation to relief from the relentless cold. The tiger entered first, and the boy, without hesitation, followed. Inside, the cave was spacious and dry. The tiger lay down again, and with an even deeper purr, gestured with its head for the boy to come closer. Exhausted, the little boy curled up beside the tiger's warm, soft body, feeling the animal warmth penetrate his chilled bones. For the first time since he had been abandoned, a faint peace enveloped him. The tiger's blue eyes watched him, vigilant, while the boy, safe in the warmth of his wild guardian, finally allowed himself to close his eyes. The fever still high, but the fear, for now, dormant. That encounter in the forest was not the end, but the beginning of an unexpected hope. When the little boy opened his eyes again, the world still spun, but the darkness of the night had been replaced by a soft twilight filtering through the cave entrance. The fever, though persistent, seemed less oppressive. The warmth that enveloped him was no longer just a sensation, but a comforting and constant presence. He was nestled against the soft, warm body of the albino tiger, feeling the slow, powerful rhythm of its breathing. The fear of the forest, of predators, and of loneliness had diminished, replaced by a strange yet profound sense of security. His small fingers, almost by instinct, touched the tiger's dense, silky fur, and the beast responded with a soft purr that vibrated in its chest, a sound that seemed to calm every nerve in his fragile body. The tiger, its blue eyes still vigilant, merely watched him, without any sign of aggression. It seemed to understand the boy's fragility, his need for tenderness. Later, when hunger began to gnaw at the little boy's stomach, the tiger rose with silent grace. It left the cave for a brief moment, returning with a handful of wild berries, which it gently deposited at the boy's feet. There weren't many, but the gesture was one of care that transcended any barrier between species. The little boy, with a dry throat, picked up one of the berries, feeling the sweetness explode in his mouth, a relief for his thirst and weakness. Each small bite was a reminder that he was not completely alone, that there was a protective force by his side. Far away, in the house that now seemed too empty, the stepmother named Helena felt a perverse relief. The absence of the sick little boy meant that her inheritance plans could finally proceed unhindered. She had convinced herself that abandonment was the only solution, a drastic measure for a problem she saw as a burden. However, a pang of uneasiness, which she refused to acknowledge as guilt, began to corrode her false tranquility. The forest was merciless, and she knew it. But, for Helena, the idea that the boy could have survived was inconceivable, a threat to her selfish desires. She tried to ignore the persistent thoughts, the images of the boy's pale face, and focused on her future, now, supposedly, free of obstacles. Meanwhile, in the small village near the forest, the little boy's absence did not go unnoticed for long. Neighbors, accustomed to seeing him, began to question. The story that he had been taken to distant relatives sounded hollow, and Helena's evasive attitude only fueled suspicions. Whispers began to circulate, initially about the disappearance, then mixed with old tales and local legends about sightings of a rare and majestic creature in the dense woods, an albino tiger. At first, they were just fishermen's tales, or perhaps hunters who had gotten lost in the depths of the forest. But the persistence of the reports and the strange coincidence with the boy's disappearance began to sow a seed of curiosity and concern in some more attentive and kind hearts. The forest, which was once just a backdrop to village life, now seemed to hold a secret, a mystery that was beginning to unfold. Inside the cave, oblivious to the murmurs of the outside world, the little boy felt the fever diminish in slow waves. The tiger's constant warmth, the silent protection, and even the berries the beast had brought were a more effective remedy than any potion. He felt weak, but hope, which was once a thin thread, now strengthened in his chest. That tiger, which should have been his predator, had become his guardian, his wild guardian angel. He closed his eyes again, not with fear but with a childlike trust, knowing that however vast and dangerous the forest might be, he was not alone. The sound of the tiger's purr was the safest lullaby he had ever known, promising that, even in the heart of darkness, kindness and connection could flourish in unexpected ways. The little boy, whose name was Leo, felt renewed strength with each dawn, a constant warmth that came not only from the sun that barely reached the cave, but from the massive and comforting presence beside him. The fever, once a heavy burden that dragged him into restless sleep, was now just a distant memory. An occasional chill that the tiger's body, always close, dissipated with its animal warmth. He had learned to trust that giant with snow-white fur, whose blue eyes, once mysterious and somewhat frightening, now conveyed a deep calm, almost a silent promise of protection. Leo, still weak, but with rekindled childlike curiosity, watched the tiger with admiration, his small eyes wide, following every movement of the beast. The tiger, in turn, seemed to understand each of his small gestures, each sigh. When Leo coughed, a fragile sound that echoed in the cave, the tiger approached, gently nuzzling its snout against his forehead, a soft touch that seemed to calm the cough and the fear. When thirst tightened, his dry throat begging for relief, the tiger guided him with a delicate nudge to a small pool of fresh water inside the cave, or brought damp, dewy leaves for him to chew, a gesture of care that transcended any barrier between species. That care was a balm for the boy's wounded soul, a pure and unconditional love he had never known from his stepmother. His days were filled with the quietness of the cave and the unwavering presence of his guardian. He no longer felt the despair of being abandoned. Instead, a new form of family had formed in the heart of the forest, an invisible and powerful bond. Far away, in the house that now seemed too large and cold, Helena tried to maintain the facade of a discreetly grieving widow. But with each passing day, the web of her lies became thinner, almost transparent. The neighbors' questions, once mere whispers from the corner of their mouths, were now inquisitive glances, gestures of veiled distrust that sent a shiver down her spine. "Where is little Leo?" asked Mrs. Elisa, her eyes fixed on hers, not looking away, her voice laden with genuine concern. Helena responded with evasions, with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, which remained hard and calculating. She said the boy was with distant relatives, a story that sounded hollow and convinced no one. At night, the solitude of the house, once a refuge for her selfish plans, was now an echo of her own cruelty. Images of Leo's pale face, of his frightened eyes at the moment of abandonment, invaded her thoughts, and she tossed and turned in bed, trying to silence the voice of conscience that, against her will, began to whisper. The initial relief had given way to a growing agitation, a dark premonition that accompanied her like a shadow. She feared not only the discovery of her act, but also the possibility, however remote, that the boy had survived. That would ruin everything she had planned. In the small village, stories about the majestic albino tiger and the mysterious disappearance of the little boy began to intertwine in an unsettling way, forming a knot of legends and concerns. Elias the hunter, a kind-hearted man with keen eyes, listened to the reports with a mixture of skepticism and deep concern. Elias knew the forest like the back of his hand, every trail, every stream, and knew that the presence of an albino tiger was something extraordinary, almost legendary, a sign that something unusual was happening. Moreover, the idea of a boy alone in the woods, especially a sick one, was something that tightened his chest, a pain he felt as if it were his own son. He had seen Leo's stepmother, Helena, and the coldness in her eyes had never deceived him. The story of the distant relatives seemed like a poorly told farce, a blatant lie. Elias, a man of few words but great action, decided he could not stand by while a child might be in danger. He took his old rifle, more for protection against wild animals than for hunting, and his backpack with essential supplies. His eyes scanned the map of the region, tracing the densest areas of the forest, the places where tiger sightings were most frequent, where the hope of finding something was greater. He knew the forest was vast and dangerous, but the image of the little boy, so fragile and vulnerable, propelled him with unwavering strength. "A boy doesn't just disappear like that without a trace," he murmured to himself, his brow furrowed in concern, his lips pressed in determination. "And an albino tiger. That's no coincidence. There's a story here. Elias felt that something much bigger was at stake, something that demanded his courage and compassion. Justice for an innocent child, with a last look at the village sleeping under the pale morning light. He plunged into the darkness of the woods, following the uncertain tracks of hope and mystery, determined to find the truth and, if possible, little Leo, before it was too late. Elias delved deeper and deeper into the forest, his firm, experienced steps barely breaking the dense silence of the woods. The cold morning air gave way to a softer breeze as the sun rose, filtering through the treetops and painting the ground with golden patches. He observed every detail, a turned leaf, a broken branch, an animal's footprint in the damp earth. His eyes, accustomed to the green vastness, searched for something out of place, a sign of human presence or of a creature as rare as an albino tiger. Concern for little Leo was a knot in his throat. He remembered the boy's mischievous smile, the way his eyes sparkled when telling a story. The idea that such innocence could be lost in the immensity of the forest was unbearable. Elias felt the responsibility weighing on his shoulders, the silent promise that he would not give up until he found the truth. He paused for a moment, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath of the wet earth and pine scent. There was something different in the air, a subtle energy that was not just from the wild nature. In the cave, Leo, now with less pale cheeks and brighter eyes, laughed softly as the albino tiger, in one of its rare, playful moments, nudged a dry leaf with its snout, inviting the boy to pick it up. The connection between them had become a silent dance of understanding and affection. Leo no longer feared the beast's imposing size. Instead, he saw in it the greatest and gentlest of friends. The tiger, in turn, seemed to have abandoned any trace of its fiercer wild nature in the boy's presence. Its purrs were more frequent, and it allowed Leo to nestle against its warm flank, a gesture of mutual trust that warmed the little boy's heart. Each day, Leo regained a little more of his strength, and the forest, once a place of terror, was now the home of his guardian, a sanctuary of peace and love. He missed a human home, yes, but the tiger's presence filled a void he didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, in the village, Helena's facade began to crumble under the weight of glances and questions. Mrs. Elisa, with her gentle but firm persistence, had mobilized other neighbors. They gathered in the square, whispering, their voices low, but their concerns palpable. "It's too strange," one said. "The boy was always so fragile," another added. Helena felt their eyes on her, judging, penetrating. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup. Each day, guilt, once a distant whisper, now screamed in her mind, mixed with the fear of being discovered. The image of Leo, alone in the forest, tormented her, and she wondered if he was still alive. The idea that he might return was a nightmare that kept her from sleeping, for it would mean the end of all her plans. Her heart pounded, and she felt a chill down her spine, a sense that the truth was about to come to light. Elias continued his search, guided by an instinct that rarely failed. He followed a small stream, the crystal-clear water murmuring over the stones, and it was then that he saw it. It wasn't a tiger's paw print, nor a human trail, but something more subtle, more moving. In a hidden clearing near a fallen tree, there was a small piece of blue fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a low branch. It was part of the shirt Leo wore the day he disappeared. Elias recognized it immediately. His heart leapt. He knelt, picking up the piece of cloth with his calloused hands, his eyes welling up. That was proof, a sign that Leo had been there and perhaps was still nearby. Hope, once a faint flame, now burned more intensely in his chest. He looked around, the forest seeming to whisper secrets. There were other marks on the ground, large and distinct footprints, not those of a common bear. They were the footprints of a large feline, but strangely accompanied by small marks of children's feet. Elias felt a shiver. The legend of the albino tiger and the story of the boy united there in those marks on the earth. He knew he was on the right track and that the truth, however extraordinary, was close to being revealed. Elias, with his heart pounding in his chest, followed the footprints. The combination of the large feline marks and the small child's foot tracks was unmistakable, a tapestry of hope and mystery woven into the damp earth. He advanced cautiously, his trained eyes scanning the vegetation, alert for any sign. The forest, which once seemed an impenetrable labyrinth, now revealed its secrets, guiding him to a destination he felt was of great importance. Each step was a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The idea that Leo, little Leo, could have survived and, moreover, that he was being protected by a creature as magnificent as an albino tiger was almost unbelievable. But the evidence was there, clear as the water of the stream he had just crossed. Elias's mind buzzed with questions, but his main focus was to find the boy, to bring him back to safety. Meanwhile, in the cave, Leo was stronger. He had spent the morning drawing with a piece of charcoal on the rocky wall, creating simple images of trees and a large white animal, his friend. The tiger, lying a few feet away, watched him with an almost human serenity, its blue eyes reflecting the faint light that entered. Leo, with a smile that lit up his once pale face, reached out to the tiger, which, in response, gently nuzzled its snout against his palm, a gesture of affection that had become a daily ritual. The fever had almost completely subsided, and the boy felt renewed energy, a will to live that the tiger's presence had rekindled. He knew that the forest was his temporary home, and the tiger his family. Far away, in the village, the atmosphere around Helena was increasingly heavy. The neighbors, led by Mrs. Elisa, kept questioning. Leo's absence was a hole in the community that no flimsy excuse could fill. Helena felt cornered, her nerves on edge. Every knock at the door, every glance that followed her in the street, was a reminder of her cruelty and the imminent discovery. She tried to convince herself that she had done the necessary, but the image of Leo's frightened eyes, the cold of the night she abandoned him, haunted her relentlessly. The fear of being unmasked was a slow poison that corroded her soul, and she knew that time was running out. Elias continued to follow the tracks, which now became more frequent and led to a denser area of the forest, where the trees formed an almost impenetrable canopy. He felt he was very close. The smell of damp earth and dry leaves was intense, mixed with a subtle aroma he couldn't identify, but which seemed to emanate from something wild and powerful. He quickened his pace, his heart beating faster. Suddenly, he heard it. A soft sound, a deep purr that vibrated in the air and seemed to come from a rock covered by vegetation. It wasn't a threatening purr, but a sound of contentment, of peace. Elias stopped, his rifle lowered, his breath suspended. He slowly approached the rock, pushing aside the branches and leaves that hid an opening. And then he saw. Inside, in the cozy twilight of the cave, was Leo, the little boy everyone thought was lost or worse. He was nestled against the flank of a majestic albino tiger, whose blue eyes slowly opened, fixing on Elias with surprising calm. The boy, with a piece of charcoal in his hand, raised his head, his eyes wide with surprise at seeing a human face. A shy smile, but full of relief, began to form on his lips. Elias felt tears well up in his eyes. The scene was of a beauty and tenderness that defied all logic. The hunter, the man of the forest, stood before a miracle. Elias stood there, still, the rifle still in his calloused hands, but now seeming an insignificant weight before the scene unfolding before him. The tears that welled in his eyes were not just of relief at finding Leo alive, but of deep admiration for the beauty and purity of that unexpected bond. Little Leo, his hand still extended to the beast, looked at Elias with a mixture of curiosity and a hint of apprehension, as if fearing that the man's arrival might break the magic of that sanctuary. The albino tiger, in turn, made no move. Its blue eyes, once fixed on Elias, now turned to the boy, a look of possession and affection that left no doubt about its role as guardian. Elias, his voice choked, tried to speak. "Leo, my little Leo," he murmured, taking a hesitant step into the cave. The tiger emitted a low purr, almost a warning, and Leo huddled a little closer against the soft flank of the beast, as if seeking protection. That was a shock to Elias. The boy, whom he expected to find terrified and desperate for rescue, seemed to find safety in the arms of a predator. Elias slowly lowered the rifle, leaning it against the rocky wall. He extended his empty hand, a gesture of peace. "I won't hurt him, Leo. I'm Elias. I came for you." The boy blinked, his eyes still wide and full of caution. He looked at the tiger, then at Elias, as if asking for permission or advice. The tiger nuzzled its snout against Leo's head, a gentle movement that seemed to reassure the boy. It was then that Leo, in a fragile but surprisingly firm voice, said, "He's my friend. I don't want to go." The words echoed in the cave, hitting Elias like lightning, an unexpected turning point. The little boy didn't want to be rescued from that wild guardian. He wanted to stay. Elias's heart tightened. His mission, which had seemed so clear, now became complex, full of emotional nuances he hadn't foreseen. He had imagined a meeting of relief and gratitude, not a refusal. The tiger, as if understanding the conversation, raised its head and looked directly at Elias, its blue eyes conveying an intelligence and depth the hunter had never seen in a wild animal. There was no threat, only a silent determination, a promise that it would not give up its protégé. Elias understood that this was not captivity, but a home, forged by adversity and the purest love. He felt a pang of shame for having underestimated the capacity for connection between species, and for having presumed that Leo would be unhappy. The truth was that the boy seemed happier and safer there than anywhere else. Far away in the village, Helena's paranoia reached its peak. She locked herself in her house, curtains drawn, phone unplugged. Every shadow at the window, every creak of the wood was a sign that the truth was approaching. Mrs. Elisa and the other neighbors had taken their concerns to the local police, who, though skeptical about the tiger story, could not ignore the boy's disappearance and Helena's strange conduct. The social pressure was an overwhelming burden, and Helena felt suffocated, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She knew she was on the verge, and the idea that Leo might be alive somewhere was a constant torment, a palpable threat to her freedom and her plans. Back in the cave, Elias made a decision. He couldn't force Leo to leave. Not now. He needed to gain the trust of the boy and the tiger. He stepped back, sitting on the cold cave floor, at a respectful distance. "All right, Leo," he said, his voice soft. "I won't take you, not now. Can I stay a while, just to make sure you're okay?" Leo looked at the tiger, which nuzzled its snout against his cheek. The boy nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on his lips. Elias felt a warmth in his chest. The miracle was not just finding Leo alive, but witnessing the love that kept him there. He knew that the journey to bring Leo back would be longer and more complex than he had imagined, but he was willing to undertake it, whatever the cost, respecting the extraordinary bond that had formed in the heart of the forest. Elias remained seated on the cold cave floor at a respectful distance, observing the scene unfolding. Leo's words, "He's my friend, I don't want to go," echoed in his mind, shattering all his expectations. He had come to rescue, to save a defenseless child from a cruel fate, but he found a boy who had forged his own sanctuary, his own family, in the wild heart of the forest. The hunter, with all his experience in the woods, had never imagined such a scenario. His eyes, which had seen so many wonders and dangers, now fixed on the albino tiger, whose blue eyes seemed to reflect an ancestral wisdom, a protective soul. Elias felt a profound humility. He had judged the forest and its inhabitants with human logic, but life there followed its own rules, weaving bonds that transcended common understanding. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions. The mission would not be simple. It was not just about bringing Leo back to civilization, but about honoring the connection the boy had found. "Leo," Elias said, his voice soft and patient, "I understand, but your family, they are worried, and you need care. A doctor." He avoided mentioning Helena, knowing that the stepmother did not represent a safe home for the boy. Leo, nestled against the tiger, looked up at Elias, his large, expressive eyes conveying a mixture of loyalty and subtle sadness. He did not want to abandon his guardian. The tiger, in turn, let out a low, almost imperceptible purr, as if affirming its presence and its role. Elias spent the day in the cave, remaining silent most of the time, just observing. He offered Leo a piece of bread and some water he had brought, and the boy accepted with hesitation, always looking at the tiger for approval. Gradually, Leo's distrust began to diminish. He started drawing again on the cave wall, and Elias watched him, feeling his heart warm with each childlike stroke. The hunter realized that the key to Leo was not force, but patience and respect for that bond. He knew he would need time, and that communication with the village would be a challenge. Meanwhile, in the village, Helena's situation deteriorated rapidly. Mrs. Elisa, tireless in her search for the truth, had gathered more testimonies and indirect evidence. The local police, once reluctant, now took the accusations more seriously. 2 officers had visited Helena, asking direct questions about Leo's whereabouts and the story of the distant relatives. Helena, with a pale face and trembling hands, tried to maintain her facade, but her answers were evasive, full of contradictions. She felt the net closing in. The house, once her refuge, now seemed like a prison. Every shadow, every noise, was a reminder of her act and the imminent punishment. She tossed and turned in bed at night, sleep eluding her, tormented by the image of Leo and the fear of being unmasked. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a deafening scream in her mind. Back in the cave, night fell, bringing with it a biting cold. Elias lit a small fire at the cave entrance, careful not to scare the tiger. The warmth and dancing light created a cozy atmosphere. Leo, exhausted, fell asleep, nestled against the tiger, which protected him with its warm body. Elias watched the two, feeling a deep emotion. He was not just a hunter, he was a guardian, a link between 2 worlds. He knew that the challenge of convincing Leo to return would be immense, and that the story of the albino tiger would change the lives of everyone in the village. But that night, under the starlight and the warmth of the fire, he felt he was exactly where he should be, witnessing a love that defied nature and reason, ready to protect the boy and his wild guardian, whatever the cost. Elias spent the night on vigil, the campfire crackling softly, painting dancing shadows on the cave walls. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, watched Leo and the tiger. The boy slept deeply, his face serene, nestled against the warm, soft flank of the beast. The tiger, in turn, seemed a silent guardian, its blue eyes half closed, but always alert. Elias felt a growing reverence for that majestic creature. It was not a common wild animal. It was a being of rare intelligence and sensitivity, an improbable guardian angel. The hunter, who had always seen the forest as a place of survival and hunting, now saw it with new eyes, perceiving the depth of the bonds that could form there. He knew that the task of reintegrating Leo into the human world would be delicate. It was not enough to simply rescue him, it was necessary to respect the love the boy had found. At dawn, the pale sunlight filtered into the cave, waking Leo. The boy blinked, stretching against the tiger, which let out a soft purr. Seeing Elias, Leo hesitated for an instant, but a small smile appeared on his lips. Elias, with a slow gesture, offered him a piece of dried fruit from his backpack. Leo looked at the tiger, which nuzzled its snout against his hand, as if approving. The boy took the fruit, eating it slowly, his eyes fixed on Elias. The barrier of distrust was diminishing, replaced by a childlike curiosity. Elias spent the morning talking softly with Leo, telling simple stories about the forest, about the birds and the trees, always maintaining a respectful distance from the tiger, which watched them attentively. He noticed that the boy, though stronger, still coughed occasionally and knew that he needed proper medical care. Far away in the village, Helena's situation had turned into a public nightmare. Mrs. Elisa, with her unwavering determination, had mobilized not only the police, but also the local press. A small newspaper from the neighboring town had published an article about the mysterious disappearance of the boy Leo and the strange conduct of his stepmother. The news spread like wildfire. Helena, now, was not only the target of whispers, but of open looks of repulsion and distrust. 2 detectives from the capital had arrived in the village, taking the case seriously. They had interrogated Helena for hours, their penetrating questions unraveling the inconsistencies in her story. The stepmother's facade of coldness crumbled under the weight of the pressure. She felt cornered, with no way out. Her inheritance plans, once so concrete, now seemed like a sandcastle about to be swept away by the tide of truth. She had completely isolated herself, refusing to answer the door or the phone, but the solitude only intensified her torment. The image of Leo, alone in the forest, tormented her incessantly, mixed with the dread of being unmasked and facing the consequences of her cruelty. Back in the cave, Elias knew he could no longer postpone communication with the village. He needed help for Leo and to deal with Helena's situation. But how to bring Leo back without him feeling betrayed, without the tiger being threatened? He decided that he would need a careful plan, one that involved understanding and accepting the extraordinary bond between the boy and the beast. He stood up, picking up his backpack. "Leo," he said, his voice gentle, "I need to go to the village, but I'll be back. I promise. You and your friend will be safe here." The boy looked at the tiger, then at Elias, his eyes expressing a new trust. Elias felt a pang in his chest. He was about to leave a miracle behind, but it was for Leo's good. He turned, casting a last look at the tiger, which watched him with an almost human serenity. The hunter knew that the truth, however unbelievable, needed to be told, and that the love and loyalty he had witnessed in those days would forever change everyone's lives, including his own. He plunged into the woods, carrying with him the promise of a return and the hope of a future where compassion would prevail. Elias plunged into the woods, carrying with him the promise of a return and the hope of a future where compassion would prevail. The path back to the village seemed longer than the journey out, each step laden with the weight of the truth he carried. The forest, which was once a refuge of silence and mystery, now seemed full of echoes of Leo's words, the tiger's serenity, and the urgency of his mission. He knew that the story he had to tell would be met with skepticism, perhaps even ridicule. An abandoned boy, surviving in the forest, cared for by an albino tiger. It sounded like a fairy tale, not the cold, hard reality the village was accustomed to facing. But Elias had witnessed it. He had seen the tenderness in the feline's eyes, the unwavering trust in Leo's eyes. That was no illusion. His mind worked incessantly, devising a plan. He couldn't just arrive and announce the miracle. He would need proof, a way to present the story that wouldn't scare people or endanger the tiger. The animal, despite its gentleness with Leo, was still a wild beast, and the villagers' reaction could be unpredictable. Elias felt the overwhelming responsibility on his shoulders. He was the link between two worlds, the guardian of a secret that could change everything. He quickened his pace, the image of Leo smiling in the cave, warming his heart and renewing his determination. As he approached the village, the dense, charged atmosphere was palpable. Police cars and a press vehicle were parked near Helena's house. Mrs. Elisa and a group of neighbors gathered in the street, their faces displaying a mixture of concern and indignation. Elias felt a shiver. The truth was already in motion, and his arrival would be the final catalyst. He went directly to the detectives who were talking at Helena's doorstep, their faces serious and tired. "I found the boy," Elias said, his voice hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. The words, simple and direct, paralyzed the conversation. The detectives turned, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Inside the house, Helena heard the commotion. The sound of Elias's voice, unmistakable, pierced the walls and hit her like a blow. Her heart pounded, a cold panic coursing through her veins. She ran to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtains. She saw Elias, dusty and exhausted, talking to the police. And then she heard the words that made her stagger. "I found the boy." The truth, the nightmare that had tormented her day and night had materialized. Leo was alive. The idea that the boy had survived and that Elias had found him was a devastating blow to her plans and her sanity. She felt the walls of the house closing in, the air thinning. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and cold sweat ran down her forehead. The facade of coldness and indifference she had maintained for so long crumbled in an instant, revealing a terrified woman, cornered by her own actions. She knew she was lost. The image of Leo, whom she had abandoned to his fate, now returned to haunt her with overwhelming force. Elias, outside, was the personification of her ruin, the herald of the justice she so feared. The detectives, after the initial shock, began to ask questions, their eyes narrowed with distrust. "Where? How? Alone?" one of them asked, his voice laden with skepticism. Elias took a deep breath, knowing that the hardest part was just beginning. He looked at the dark forest in the distance, feeling the silent presence of the tiger and Leo's trust. He would need all his courage and faith to tell the story that defied reason, but he was ready. He would tell every detail, every gesture of affection from the tiger, every smile from Leo. The truth, however unbelievable, would be his only weapon. He began to narrate, his voice firm, his eyes fixed on the detectives, conveying the certainty of one who had witnessed a miracle. He knew that the path to acceptance would be arduous, but Leo's life and the tiger's reputation depended on his ability to make the world believe in the most improbable love. Justice, he felt, was on its way, and compassion finally would find its place. Elias began to narrate, his voice firm, his eyes fixed on the detectives, conveying the certainty of one who had witnessed a miracle. He spoke of the tracks, the peculiar purr that guided him, the hidden cave. He described Leo, fragile but with a sparkle in his eyes, nestled against the soft flank of the albino tiger. He spoke of the beast's wild tenderness, of the blue eyes that conveyed an almost human intelligence, and of Leo's words, "He's my friend, I don't want to go." Each sentence was charged with genuine emotion, with a conviction that defied logic. The detectives, accustomed to concrete facts and tangible evidence, listened with a mixture of perplexity and fascination. Their faces, once hardened by skepticism, began to show wrinkles of doubt and a hint of admiration. They exchanged glances, incredulity battling against the seriousness in Elias's gaze. One of them, the older one, stroked his grey beard. "An albino tiger, caring for a child. That's unbelievable, Mr. Elias." "I know what it sounds like," Elias replied without faltering, "but I saw it. I spent 2 days there. The boy is safer with him than he ever was. And he needs care, yes, but not to be torn from his protector. He paused, his eyes welling up. It's a miracle, detective. A miracle that needs to be protected. Mrs. Elisa, who had approached, nodded vigorously, her hands clasped over her chest. I always knew there was something good out there. The boy is pure, and the forest embraced him. The neighbors murmured, some shocked, others visibly moved. The story, however fantastic, resonated with the hope they had all lost. Inside the house, Helena, her ear pressed to the door, heard fragments of the conversation. Albino tiger, miracle, protected. The words mingled in her disturbed mind, forming a mosaic of horror. Leo was alive, and worse, he was with a tiger. Not dead, not missing, but alive and with a story that incriminated her irrefutably. She felt a chill run down her spine, the image of little Leo, whom she had abandoned to his fate, now transformed into a ghost that would haunt her forever. Her plans, her inheritance, everything crumbled before that absurd yet real account. She staggered back, her legs weak, and collapsed onto the sofa, covering her face with trembling hands. Tears, long suppressed, streamed through her fingers, hot and bitter. They were not tears of regret, but of despair and fear of imminent punishment. The detectives, after a brief exchange of glances, made a decision. "Mr. Elias," said the younger detective, "we need to go there, see with our own eyes. If what you say is true, the situation is even more serious than we imagined. And Mrs. Helena," he gestured towards the house, "will have a lot to explain." Elias nodded, a subtle relief on his face. The hardest part, that of being believed, was beginning to yield. "I'll take you," he said, his voice now lighter. "But we need to be careful. The tiger trusts Leo, but it's a wild animal. And Leo, he has a deep bond with him." The news spread through the village like lightning. The boy Leo was alive, and a hunter had found him, cared for by an albino tiger. Incredulity mingled with hope and a feverish curiosity. Mrs. Elisa, with a smile of relief, ran to tell the other neighbors, her eyes shining with the confirmation that good always finds a way. As Elias prepared to guide the detectives back to the forest, Helena, in her isolation, felt the weight of the world collapsing on her. Justice, which she thought she had deceived, was knocking at her door. And there was nowhere left to run. Leo's miracle was her condemnation, and she knew that the end was near. The forest, once a silent accomplice to her crime, now delivered the truth, and with it, the inevitable retribution. Elias led the way back into the forest, the detectives and Mrs. Elisa following him with a mixture of apprehension and almost childlike curiosity. The older detective, named Roberto, walked with a furrowed brow, his experienced eyes scanning the woods as if searching for something that could disprove Elias's story. The younger one, Carlos, maintained a more open yet still skeptical gaze. Mrs. Elisa, for her part, seemed to float, renewed hope in every step, her lips murmuring silent prayers. The cold forest air seemed to cut through the incredulity, and the dense silence, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves under their feet, created an atmosphere of suspense. Elias felt the responsibility of each step, each branch he pushed aside, knowing that Leo's life and the world's understanding depended on that moment. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the cave entrance came into view. Elias gestured for them to stop, raising his hand. "Silence," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. The detectives and Mrs. Elisa held their breath, and then they saw. Inside the cave, under the faint light filtering from the entrance, Leo sat, drawing on the wall with a piece of charcoal. Beside him, majestic and serene, rested the albino tiger, its blue eyes half closed but vigilant. The scene was of a beauty and unreality that paralyzed everyone. Detective Roberto, who had seen everything in his career, felt a shiver run down his spine. His lips parted in disbelief, and he blinked several times, as if trying to ward off a mirage. Carlos, the younger detective, brought a hand to his mouth, his eyes wide, reflecting pure astonishment. Mrs. Elisa let out a muffled sob, her hands clasped over her chest, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Leo, sensing their presence, looked up. His eyes, once full of distrust, now shone with a mixture of curiosity and surprising calm. The tiger, with a slow and graceful movement, raised its head, its gaze assessing the newcomers. There was no aggression, only a protective vigilance. Elias stepped forward, his voice soft. "Leo, I brought some friends. They came to see you." The boy looked at the tiger, which nuzzled its snout against his cheek as if in approval. Leo nodded, a small smile appearing on his lips. Detective Roberto, still in shock, felt the truth impose itself with overwhelming force. This was not a trick, not an illusion. It was a miracle. Meanwhile, in the village, the commotion had reached its peak. The news of Elias's return and his claim of having found Leo, now corroborated by the detective's departure for the forest, had spread like wildfire. Helena's house was surrounded by a curious and indignant crowd. Reporters from the local newspaper with their cameras and notebooks recorded every detail. Inside the house, Helena, completely helpless, heard the murmurs and camera flashes through the curtains. The image of Leo alive and the certainty that the truth about the tiger would be revealed crushed her. She heard the sound of firm footsteps at the door and then loud knocks. "Mrs. Helena, open the door. We are the police." Detective Roberto's voice, who had briefly returned to the village before heading to the cave, sounded like thunder. There was nowhere left to run. The siege had closed, and justice, merciless and inevitable, finally knocked at her door. Helena's hands trembled uncontrollably, and she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The end of her freedom, the end of her cruel plans, had arrived. In the cave, Detective Roberto, with tears in his eyes, knelt at a safe distance. "Leo," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "you are a very brave boy." Mrs. Elisa, openly weeping, reached out to the boy, who looked at her with a sweetness that melted everyone's hearts. The climax of incredulity had transformed into a climax of pure emotion and admiration. The miracle was there, palpable. The truth, however fantastic, had been revealed, and with it, the certainty that compassion and loyalty could flourish in the wildest and most unexpected places. In the village, the sound of knocking on Helena's door echoed like a final verdict. She could no longer hide. Her hands still trembling, but with a chilling resignation, she rose from the sofa. The mask of coldness she had worn for so long completely collapsed, revealing a small, frightened woman, cornered by her own choices. As she opened the door, the light from the camera flashes blinded her for an instant, and the condemning stares of the crowd hit her like stones. Detective Roberto, with a serious expression, but without anger, only weariness, uttered the words that would seal her fate. "Mrs. Helena, you are under arrest. We need you to come with us." She did not resist. Her shoulders slumped, and she allowed them to guide her out, her head bowed, unable to face the neighbors' faces. The silence that followed her departure was more deafening than any scream, a mute testament to the justice that, though delayed, had arrived. Back in the cave, the atmosphere was one of touching delicacy. Elias, with Mrs. Elisa's help, began to explain to Leo that he needed medical care and a safe place to live. The boy, his eyes fixed on the tiger, seemed to understand. He turned to the beast, hugging its neck tightly, his face buried in its soft fur. The tiger let out a low purr, a sound that seemed both a farewell and a promise. It nuzzled its snout against Leo's head, then looked at Elias with a depth the hunter would never forget. It was a look of trust, of surrender. The tiger seemed to know that Leo would be safe. Elias, with a lump in his throat, extended his hand to the boy. Come, Leo. You're going to have a new home, full of love. Leo hesitated for a moment, then took Elias's hand, but not before casting a last look at his guardian. It was a silent farewell, but laden with all the love and gratitude a small heart could feel. The majestic tiger watched them leave, its blue eyes following them until they disappeared from view, an imposing silhouette at the cave entrance, like an eternal sentinel. The return to the village was a silent triumph. Leo, still weak, but with a renewed sparkle in his eyes, was greeted with tears and hugs. Mrs. Elisa took him to her home, where a warm bath, clean clothes, and a nutritious meal awaited him. The cough that tormented him began to subside, and the warmth of home and the unconditional affection of Mrs. Elisa and Elias began to heal not only his body, but also the invisible wounds of his soul. The story of the albino tiger and its loyalty spread, becoming a living legend in the region. Detective Roberto, after witnessing the miracle, ensured that the tiger would be protected, and an area of the forest was demarcated so that it could live in peace, away from hunting and human curiosity. Helena, in turn, was formally accused and, after a swift trial with irrefutable evidence, convicted of child abandonment and cruelty. Her inheritance plans crumbled, and she faced the consequences of her actions in an isolation she herself had imposed on Leo, but now without the possibility of redemption. Leo found in Elias and Mrs. Elisa the family he had always dreamed of. Elias, the solitary hunter, discovered a new purpose, becoming a loving father and a guardian of the forest and its secrets. Mrs. Elisa, with her generous heart, embraced Leo as a grandson, filling her home with laughter and affection. The story of Leo, the boy of the forest, and his wild guardian angel became a powerful reminder that even on the darkest nights, hope, compassion, and the most improbable bonds can flourish, transforming lives and inspiring everyone to believe in the strength of true love. Months unfolded into a tapestry of sunny days and tranquil nights, weaving a new life for Leo. In Mrs. Elisa's cozy home, the little boy blossomed. His cough, once a constant lament, disappeared completely, replaced by laughter that echoed through the rooms, filling the home with a melody of pure joy. His pale cheeks gained a healthy, rosy hue, and his eyes, once veiled by fever and fear, now sparkled with the vivacity of a child who finally knew security and unconditional love. Elias, the hunter who had found a new purpose, dedicated himself to Leo with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He taught the boy about the secrets of the forest, no longer with the gaze of one seeking prey, but with the reverence of a guardian. Together, they explored safe trails, observed colorful birds, and learned the names of the trees, with Elias explaining the importance of every living being. Leo absorbed every lesson, his small fingers intertwined with Elias's, mutual trust growing with each step. Mrs. Elisa, with her generous heart, was the personification of the maternal affection Leo had never known. Her wrinkled hands prepared nutritious meals and told stories of fairies and heroes, while her tight hugs dispelled any shadow of sadness that might arise. She patiently taught him to read and write, and watched with tears in her eyes how quickly the boy opened up to the world, transforming from a frightened child into a curious and lively boy. The albino tiger, Leo's wild guardian angel, remained a silent but powerful presence in everyone's lives. Elias and Leo made regular visits to the demarcated area in the forest, always with the utmost respect and caution. The majestic and serene tiger recognized the boy with a soft purr and a nuzzle of its snout, a gesture of affection that spoke louder than any words. Leo, in turn, would never forget the beast's loyalty, and the bond between them, though now at a distance, was living proof that love could transcend all barriers. The story of Leo and his wild protector became a beacon of hope for the village, a legend told and retold, inspiring everyone to look at the world with more compassion and to believe in the power of the most improbable bonds. Helena's cruelty, now a distant memory and a dark reminder of what darkness can do, served only to highlight the light Leo brought into their lives. Elias and Mrs. Elisa, united by their love for Leo, found new meaning in their existences, a purpose that went beyond their solitary lives. They were a family, forged in adversity and strengthened by altruism. Leo, the abandoned boy who defied fate, grew up surrounded by love, forever marked by the courage and loyalty of his wild guardian angel, and by the certainty that, even on the most merciless nights, kindness always finds a way to illuminate the world. Years unfolded gently, weaving a rich tapestry of memories and lessons into Leo's life. He was no longer the fragile, frightened little boy. He had transformed into a robust child, with an easy smile and eyes that reflected the light of the forest and the sweetness of the home that welcomed him. At the village school, Leo stood out not only for his sharp intelligence, but for his innate kindness, always ready to help classmates and share his stories, though the most fantastic ones about his wild friend were told only in whispers to Elias and Mrs. Elisa, kept as a precious treasure. He loved to draw, and his notebooks were filled with majestic tigers with deep blue eyes and vibrant forests, full of life and mystery that only he seemed to understand so profoundly. Elias, now known to all as the Forest Father, found in fatherhood a fulfillment he had never imagined. His steps, once guided by the hunt, were now light and protective, accompanying Leo on his daily explorations. He taught the boy to respect nature in every leaf and every stream, to listen to the whisper of the wind through the trees, and to understand the subtle signs of animals, instilling in him a deep and reverent love for the wild world. Sometimes on their walks, Elias and Leo would pause at a high point, from where they could glimpse the tiger's protected area. A reverent silence enveloped them, and Leo knew that somewhere among those dense trees his guardian still watched over him, an invisible presence, but eternally present in his heart, a bond that time could not unravel. Mrs. Elisa, with her snow-white hair and a hug that was a balm for the soul, continued to be the pillar of love and wisdom in Leo's life. She taught him to cook Elias's favorite dishes, to sew small patches on his clothes, and to care for the garden plants with the same dedication with which she cared for him. Her bedtime stories, once fairy tales, now included the legend of the boy and the tiger, retold with a sparkle in her eyes that kept the magic of the miracle alive. She watched Leo grow, her heart overflowing with gratitude for having been part of such an extraordinary story, and for having the chance to offer such a special boy the unconditional love he deserved. The village, which once lived under the shadow of mystery and cruelty, had transformed. The story of Leo and the albino tiger became a constant reminder of the human capacity for resilience and the unexpected kindness that can emerge in the darkest moments. People became more attentive to each other, more willing to help, inspired by the courage of a boy and the loyalty of a beast. The forest, once viewed with a certain fear, was now respected as a sanctuary, a place of wonders and profound lessons for all. Helena, for her part, remained a distant figure, her memory serving as a dark but necessary echo of the darkness that Leo's and the tiger's kindness had overcome. Her absence was a reminder that justice, at times, manifests not only in punishment, but in the restoration of hope and the building of a better future for those who were hurt. A future that Leo now lived fully. Leo, now almost a young man, carried with him not the scars of abandonment, but the strength of a miraculous survival and the wisdom of an unbreakable bond with nature. He knew that his life was a a living testament that love, in its purest and most unexpected forms, has the power to heal all wounds and transform destinies. With Elias and Mrs. Elisa by his side, he looked to the future with the certainty that kindness would always triumph, and that his wild guardian angel, the majestic albino tiger, would always be in his heart, an eternal symbol of loyalty and protection, illuminating his path with the light of a love that transcended the ordinary and celebrated life in its most beautiful and inspiring essence.